We're moving on now to, I guess, kind of our last topic of outcome two, which involves looking at, I guess, different ways that we address health and well-being and human development, particularly through aid, so the provision of aid. So today we're just going to focus on these first 2 points, which is looking at different types of aid, and particularly at Australia's aid program. And then in the next few lessons, we'll look at the role of non-government organisations, as well as what effective aid looks like. So firstly, what is aid? It's probably good to have a little definition written down. Aid can be defined as assistance given to countries or communities in the event of a crisis or for the development of long-term sustainable improvements. And as you go through this lesson, you'll probably notice that they really are quite different. Providing aid following a crisis is very different to providing aid for the aim of kind of long-term sustainable improvement. There's 3 types of aid that we focus on, and it is really important that you know the difference between these. So there is emergency aid, bilateral aid, and multilateral aid. And we're going to go through those now. So just starting with emergency aid, the name, really kind of gives you a pretty good clue as to what that is. It's sometimes called humanitarian aid. So this is short-term relief or assistance that is given usually following natural disasters and through conflict. Okay, but I guess you could argue that a lot of the aid that is being delivered as a result of COVID-19 is an example of emergency aid, because it's not kind of something that was really planned for. It's kind of, a disaster. This type of aid, and this is, I guess, what a lot of people think of when they think of aid, what they see on the news. This often includes things like providing food and water, medicine, shelter and clothing, and personnel. And by personnel, we mean people on the ground that are needed to help out. So that could be health workers. Australia will often send like paramedics or doctors to help out in a disaster. It could be other types of emergency workers. So, people that can help clear, if it's a natural disaster, helping to clear spaces or helping to, move people through areas, things like that. Often there might be people that help with setting up communication systems, keeping in mind that often countries that require aid don't have very good systems set up. It might be providing transport or also law and order. So that could be things like police or army support. Keeping in mind, obviously, if it's in a conflict, that would make sense. But even after natural disasters and things like that, that can cause a lot of panic, and there's often help needed in those areas. When you jump into the Google Doc, you'll notice that question 1, it involves the different types of aid. So you could just jump in now and do the first little bit, just a quick description of emergency aid, or if you'd like, you can come back at the end and do it all together. All right, bilateral aid, and bi means 2, is aid that is given from one government to another government. So I guess you could say you have a donor and you have a recipient country. Okay, this is very different to emergency aid. The aim of bilateral aid is to bring about long-term sustainable development. Okay, so there is a lot of planning that goes into these types of things. For it to be effective or good aid, the donor country, so let's say, for example, Australia, would really consult a lot with the recipient country. This particular example here is Papua New Guinea. But identifying what that country needs, what their priorities are, how you can best help. And we'll look more at effective aid in the next lesson. So this is quite different. It's not usually providing things like food or water, those kind of short-term necessities. It's about that long-term development. So Bilateral aid often focuses on things like infrastructure projects, and there's an example that you'll look at in a little bit, education programs, developing health services. So this is quite different to, you know, sending doctors to just help out in an emergency, but this would be, you know, helping to build hospitals or create hospital systems or train doctors, things like that. Immunization programs, even though I guess you could say that they're not so much a long-term intervention, they are often considered bilateral aid because they have long-term benefits. Again, we'll look at effective aid in the next lesson, but really, really important to note that if we're talking about bilateral aid, it needs to build the capacity of the recipient country. And what we mean by that is, you know, if Australia sent 500 teachers over to Papua New Guinea for 1 year to teach kids, that's great. That might have an impact for a year. But if they're not training teachers in that place to be able to do that themselves, then there's no long-term impact. Okay, so it's really about building the capacity of recipient countries so that they're not requiring support as much moving forward, which is, I guess, quite different to emergency aid, where it is just giving things that are needed in the moment. All right, multilateral aid is quite similar in what it aims to achieve, but this is when the government, so let's say the Australian government, instead of giving money or assistance or aid directly to another country, that is given to international organisations. So examples of that are things like the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and then those organisations use that money to address global issues with, you know, that really big goal in achieving equity in human development. So like I said, some of these things might be quite similar to bilateral aid, but the focus here, I guess, is on these global things. So even though, you know, the World Health Organization and the World Bank and the UN will run programs in specific countries, they're aimed at improving health and well-being and human development at a global level. Okay, so these are some of the big areas of focus at the moment. Climate change, disease control obviously is a big one at the moment. Again, infrastructure, economic programs to reduce poverty, and education and health. Okay, so it is a bit different to bilateral aid, where the Australian government kind of gives money but then doesn't really run the programs itself. All right, like with all things, there are strengths and limitations to each of these types of aid. I don't want you to get too bogged down in trying to memorize all of these things. I've never seen this come up in an exam. It could, but I just want you to have you know, just a little bit of a thought of, you know, what are some of the good things about each of these types of aid and what the limitations are. So emergency aid, I guess, you know, that really big goal of it is that it saves lives. It's after a disaster, and it improves that kind of short-term well-being. Some of the problems, or I guess limitations, of this type of aid is that it doesn't address any underlying issues. So let's say, for example, there was a tsunami, and, you know, a lot of houses got wiped away. You know, we can provide short-term aid that will give food and shelter to those people, but it might not address the fact that those houses were very poorly built in the first place, or that, you know, climate change is affecting the likelihood of those disasters, or that there's not enough money to provide support. So it's not fixing any of those issues. If emergency aid is required for a very long time, and I guess that's because these things aren't getting addressed, that can create dependency. And what we mean is countries that require aid in order for people to survive. And obviously that's not a situation that we want any countries to be in. Bilateral aid, probably one of the biggest benefits of this from a political point of view is that it builds relationships between countries. And that is a big reason that countries do it. It builds those relationships between countries. As we said, it's addressing long-term sustainable development issues, and it focuses on building capacity, which decreases that reliance on other countries, if it is done well. Some limitations of this: there can be a lot of corruption in recipient countries. We've talked about that before as a characteristic of a lot of low-income countries. So if money or supplies or personnel aren't being used properly, that can be a real issue. It often, really focuses on what the donor country wants. And we're going to look at Australia's aid priorities at the moment, but that can be a limitation. It doesn't necessarily meet the needs. Well, I mean, it will meet needs of the recipient country, but also the donor country is the one paying for it. So often they will kind of negotiate what meets their political needs. Often bilateral aid is focused on urban areas, which, I guess makes sense because they tend to have higher populations, but we have looked a lot about at inequities, and it can, I guess, create more inequity if we're improving life in certain areas and not in others. Multilateral strength is that we're looking at this kind of global level. And if you think about places like, the World Health Organization, for example, they have reach into every single country in the world. Whereas, Australia might not have relationships with some countries and can't provide support to those countries. So it does give that kind of centralized organization that has a lot of reach. It also tends to be less political. Okay, so it's not really, if Australia is giving money to the World Health Organization, Australia is not allowed to then say, but we only want this money spent on providing this in this exact country. The World Health Organization makes that decision as experts in global health. Some limitations: obviously there's very high administrative costs because these are very large international organizations with lots of officers and lots of staff. And from a political point of view, governments don't have a say in those decisions. So there's kind of less control over what that money is spent on. Okay, so you've got the information there just to go and finish off that table in question 1. All right, we're just going to spend about 10 minutes looking at Australia's aid program. So Australia's aid program is run by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is known as DFAT. We have this program called the Official Development Assistance, or the ODA, which is basically the money that Australia puts aside for providing bilateral and multilateral aid. Okay, so about 2/3 of our aid spending is through bilateral aid, and this is mostly to countries in the Asia Pacific region. We'll go through a map in a minute, but most of that is Australia directly providing aid through programs to specific countries. And then there's about one-third of it is provided to multilateral aid through some of those organisations that I mentioned before. Now, the money for this comes from the national budget. So basically when Australia, every year they look at how much money has been made through tax and organisations and companies and trade and all those things, and money is put aside for the ODA. Emergency aid is kind of funded as it is needed. Obviously, emergencies aren't generally planned for, so that money is made available kind of when it's needed. Now, I just want to include this because a lot of people have, I guess, different ideas around aid and how much money should be spent on aid. So in the current budget, Australia has put aside, or is planning to spend about $4.3 billion on foreign aid. Okay, so think about that number for a second. And I'd say your first thought is probably like, whoa, that's a lot of money. But it's a decrease. So this year, Australia has decreased its foreign aid budget by about 5%. So $144 million less than was spent last year. And then I think this is a really interesting graph that I found. So this was a study that was done looking at, in Australia, people's the public perception of how much money is spent on aid. So they asked a bunch of people what percentage of Australia's GNI, so what gross national income, do they think Australia spends on aid? And the average that people thought was 13%. So people thought Australia was spending 13% of our national budget on foreign aid. It then asked what they think we should be giving. So people on average said they think it should be 10%. Okay, so they thought it was 13%. They think it should be a little bit less than what it is. The reality is 0.22%. So that is the percentage of gross national income that Australia spends on foreign aid. Okay, so when you look purely at a number, $4.3 billion sounds like a lot, but actually it's a very low percentage of our total budget. And the United Nations, the expectation for high-income countries, and we know Australia is one of the highest income countries, the expectation is to spend 0.7% of the GNI on foreign aid, and we're only at 0.22. Okay, so just something to think about. We're really not providing much foreign aid, especially in comparison to some other countries. This also shows Australia's spending on foreign aid over time. Again, you don't need to know this. This is going to be assessed, but I think it's interesting to look at. You know, there's obviously peaks and troughs, but the general trend over time since the 1970s is decreasing. Okay, and this is where we're at now. We're seeing some pretty huge decreases from only about 10 years ago. And if you're politically minded, maybe jump online and have a look at which governments were in power when we were spending lots of money and which governments, are spending less money on those types of things. All right, this is the map I was talking about, just showing where the majority of our aid spending goes. You don't need to know specific countries, but yeah, really just noting that the majority of the countries that we spend our foreign aid on are in the Asia Pacific region. Lots and lots of reasons for that. I guess the main ones being that they are our closest neighbours. There is a big security benefit to that. When we talk about building these positive relationships, you want to have good, especially as a small island nation, obviously a big island, but not many people on it, you want to be pretty good friends with all of your neighbours, in case there is conflict or things like that. But also from a trade point of view, if you want to trade, food and things like that, it makes the most sense that you're doing that with the places close by, rather than, say, giving aid to places in, Eastern Europe, where it's not really, I guess, benefiting Australia. All right, the next couple of things are things that you really do need to know. I don't want you to spend too much time trying to learn the specifics of them, but you should be able to, answer any questions that come up if you just have these lists written down. So first thing is the priorities of Australia's aid program. So as we said, it's focused towards the Asia Pacific region, and there's 6 key priority areas. They are infrastructure, for example, bridges. Australia loves building bridges. Honestly, if you go, to a lot of places in Southeast Asia, when you see these really huge, impressive bridges, there's often a plaque next to it, and it's often built by Australia or Japan. Japan also love building bridges. They are so important for places that are divided by water to be able to trade and have effective livelihoods. Education and health is another priority for Australia. Gender equality. Humanitarian assistance, which I guess is that kind of emergency aid, but then also disaster reduction. So I guess this is, emergency, and then disaster reduction would be if it was provided to a specific country, it would be bilateral, or if it was giving money to organisations to do it on Australia's behalf, it would be multilateral, but that's kind of planning for disasters. So that is a long-term impact. So if you've ever been to, Indonesia and Bali and things like that, you often see these signs like for tsunami evacuation routes. That's an example of disaster reduction. So having plans in place if there is a disaster. Effective governance is another priority of Australia's aid. So that kind of involves, helping countries to improve their policies, to improve their systems, how they make political decisions and things like that. And then finally, agriculture and fisheries. And I guess this is a really, really huge one when you're looking at food security in countries. So, there's not much long-term benefit in just providing food to countries, but if you can improve agriculture and fishery systems in those countries, that helps people have food security. Okay, so just jump in and have a answer question 3. It's literally just listing those priorities. Okay, and then finally is the partnerships of Australia's aid program. And this is talking about the aid program in as a whole. So this is humanitarian, bilateral and multilateral. There are several partnerships involved. So there's, I guess, what you could call whole of government, which is DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, working with other federal departments. So, for example, they might liaise with the Department of Agriculture to help provide programs that improve agriculture. They might work with the Australian Federal Police to help provide certain programs. They might work with the Department of Health on other things. So just working within the government. There's also quite a lot of partnership with private sectors. So this includes things like banks or companies that often provide financial support, but also personnel to carry out aid programs. There's the bilateral partnerships themselves. So that's the recipient countries, as we said, mostly in the Asia Pacific region. Some countries, receive a lot more than others from Australia, but there are in total about 75 recipient countries that Australia works with. There's multilateral partnerships. So as I said before, that's about 1/3 of Australia's aid budget, and that's going towards things like the World Bank, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the Asian Development Bank to help carry out projects. And then finally, there are non-government organizations. They're a little bit different to these big international ones. You probably would have heard of a few of these. You'll see them in ads quite a lot. So things like World Vision or Oxfam or Red Cross are examples. And we're actually going to spend more time in the next lesson looking at non-government organisations in particular. So just answer question 4. And then the last thing I want you to do, see how you're going for time. But I've got a couple of videos there. Try and get through at least 1 or 2 of them. If you've got time, watch all 3. They're quite short. But these are just 3 different examples of Australia's aid program, and then a few questions I want you to answer to do with those programs. All right, thank you very much.